Welcome to the Constructed Awareness Podcast. In this episode, Tyler Orr and Phil Stillman talk about the construction of emotion. Hey, and welcome back to another episode of the Constructed Awareness Podcast. I'm Tyler Orr, and I have on with me today a good friend, Phil Stillman.
Hey, Tyler. Hey, listeners.
Great. Thanks for being here. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's the theory of constructed emotion, which is a theory that's really at the heart of CA, particularly what we refer to as the orientation theory. So we'll talk all about that. But before we start, I'll just do a quick introduction for myself. I'm Tyler Orr. I'm a counselor in Tennessee. I'm also the creator of a model of psychotherapy called constructed awareness. We'll call it CA for short. Okay, so I'll give an introduction, here in a little bit about what CA is, in case this is a new topic for you. But I want to pass it to you for a second, Phil. If you want to kind of introduce yourself, and I'm really interested in sort of like what. Okay, so we've had some great conversations since we've known each other. How long has it been?
I want to say maybe 2 years.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And we really hit it off right away.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was really impressed with your background, and I'm excited for the listeners to hear about that. But I think you have such a unique perspective to talk about this topic that we're going to talk about. So just wanted to set that up. But if you want to go ahead and just let everybody know kind of who you are and what led you here right now.
Yeah, so my name is Phil Stillman. Currently, I am a psychotherapist at Three Oaks Behavioral Health and Wellness in North Carolina. I also teach for an organization called Night School Bar, which provides graduate level education, basically either free or affordably. And I can do that because in addition to the MSW, I have a PhD in English language and literature. And before all of that, I studied biology. So there's a quick and dirty version of my background.
You're all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
What was there a particular time period of literature that you studied?
Oh yeah, my dissertation was called something like biology and British fiction in the 19th century. So I was looking at the intersection between those two things and the way they mutually formed each other.
Mm-hmm. And if I remember from our conversation, kind of a lot happened during that time period.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That led to how we understand emotions now.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I would say that if we wanted to think about the emotions we have now, we could point to the early 19th century as the moment when they emerged and became what we now think of as normal. Even as recently as the 18th century, you see a very different emotional palette. And the further back you go, the stranger things become relative to what we're used to.
Mm-hmm. Love that. So sorry, I should have introduced you as Dr. Phil.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm trying to get there soon. I got about a year left in my
Oh
program,
yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's going to be exciting.
So, very cool. Well, I'm so glad you're here. Like I said, as soon as we met, it felt like a connection. Maybe kindred spirits.
Yeah.
We're going to talk here in a little bit about what we mean by orientation, but for those who know about it, please note this is going to be the most mentally oriented podcast that we've done, because I think that's where you and I connect. Yeah. It's like as mentally oriented individuals who identifies that most of the time. Mm-hmm. We do tend to connect more intellectually, so I kind of expect that we will do that.
Yeah, I'm certain.
Today.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Is it okay if I kind of just share a little bit about constructed awareness? Because if somebody's new,
yeah, that'd be great.
They'll be lost if we're not
Yeah.
explaining this. So, Easiest way I always explain in CA is to talk about its three principles. So the first principle is if you bring awareness to something, it changes it. And so, like this most straightforward example is we all tend to behave differently alone than we do in front of other people. Like just the act of someone else observing you and being aware of you has the potential to bring about change. But that's also true for like our internal experience. It's not just that it creates change out in the world, it also changes our experience, our personal experience. So if you bring awareness to your thoughts and sensations, naturally your thoughts and sensations will change, right? And I'm sure you've seen that as a CA therapist. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't put any energy as CA therapists into trying to change the client's experience, which is common for traditional therapy where you're trying to, use willpower to overcome behaviors and thoughts and emotions. We don't do that at all. Instead, we bring awareness we help the client bring a deeper awareness to their experience, and we trust that awareness will bring the change. So awareness itself is the catalyst for change, mm-hmm. right? So what do we bring an awareness to? That's the topic of the second principle. So the second principle says that everything that you've ever experienced is only constructed by three things. And we call these the three building blocks of the human experience. So the building blocks are your thoughts, that's your mental building block, the sensations you feel in your body, that's your sensation building block, and your external sense perception, so that's your external building block. And I've sat with this for a while, Phil, I'm sure you have too. Mm-hmm. I've never experienced anything that wasn't one of those three domains.
Yeah.
Which is wild to think we can boil our entire reality down.
Yeah, that's one of the most
to those three
fascinating things mm-hmm. about CA to me, is that move.
Yeah. And that's really the topic of today. Because that is rooted in the theory of constructed emotion, which is the topic of today. The idea that our emotional experiences aren't like these innate things that are stored inside of us, ready to be activated at any given moment, which is like the basis of the classical theory of emotion, which we'll talk about later. Instead, the idea is that our emotions are constructed in the moment by these different parts of our experience, thoughts, sensations, and external sense perceptions. So we're going to talk that part to death today, for sure. But real quick, the third principle goes a step further and teaches us how to apply the first two principles and to put it into practice. So the third principle says that people tend to rely more on one building block over the other two in different situations, meaning that they orient their awareness more toward one building block than the other two. So that means that sometimes people are mentally oriented. We tend to spend most of our time being mentally oriented, mm-hmm. right? So we use our minds to regulate ourselves, to connect with other people. I don't know about you, but when I get upset, I turn to like logic and reason and planning. It's a very cognitive existence, mm-hmm. right? My wife is very different. She's sensation oriented, so she's all about her body. It's like we're minds moving through life. She's a body moving mm-hmm. through life. So if she gets upset, she regulates herself through crying and moving. It has a very like physical expression of emotions, but also like connection. She connects that way. Through more like touch and sharing space. And folks like my mom are externally oriented, so she lives outside of herself. She regulates herself by regulating people in the environment and regulating like how the environment's organized. Mm-hmm. So right, it's like if her environment is out of order, she's out of order.
Yeah.
If her environment's okay, she's okay. So that's important to just touch on because I'm sure we'll talk about being mentally oriented or just how that affects emotion. But really the focus is that second principle of how emotions are constructed in the moment. So I don't know. Anything coming up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about the fact that what one can derive from all this is that, as you said, emotions are not basic, they're not primary, they're not atomic, right, in the sense of being impossible to further subdivide. They are one way of thinking about them is that an emotion is sensation plus a concept that we use culturally and by extension personally to make sense out of sensation and out of the world. Whether that's something like nostalgia is a great example of a very recent emotion, to sentimentality, things like that. And then there are the ones that most of us consider to be universal, but again, that aren't really, like something as basic as sadness even, or loneliness is a great example.
That's great. So like it kind of like brings up the question, what is an emotion?
Right. And
that seems like a simple question that everyone should have a simple answer to, but that's the thing that's boggled my mind as I've explored this. It's like there's not an answer.
William James,
there's not a real...
Sorry to cut you off there. William James actually wrote an essay entitled "What is an Emotion?" And that he similarly doesn't land on a simple explanation, but what he does say, and I think it's famously in that essay, he says, you don't run away because you're scared because you start running, right? That for him, there's something that happens before any emotion we can name or point to, which is sensation and even perhaps movement. And so emotion is a retroactively applied, again, conceptualization or, basic training, cultural training, a way of making ourselves legible to those around us.
Yeah. Oh, let's make sure and talk about that at some point. I'm going to write that down. The cultural construction of emotion. Because that's so important, especially when we're talking about this constructed theory of emotion. I'm talking about how cultures view emotions differently. So, yeah, let's definitely circle back to that. You said something like emotion, how'd you say it? It's like it's a sensation with a concept attached.
Yeah, for me, I think Kant says something like perceptions without concepts are empty, or basically it's like perceptions without concepts are dumb because they have no language attached to them. You can't make sense of them. They're just the blooming, buzzing confusion, right, as William James called it. But concepts without perceptions are empty, right? So think about, for example, what's the square root of -1? That's a concept that has absolutely so you don't really understand it. You can conceptualize it logically, but you can't feel it, right, the way you can feel an apple or something. And so you put these things together, right, not perceptions, but sensations and concepts. Those two things are required to have an emotion, right? It starts in the body and, or the nervous system generally. And we do know that people whose bodies are, who lose access to sensation have dampened emotional experiences relative to people who have heightened sensations.
Like that's something that years ago, like before there was a CA, there was like the parts of CA that were beginning to come together in some sort of way. In my mindfulness practice that I was exploring back then, I heard somewhere, I wish I could remember who said it so I could cite them and give them credit, but yeah, that's where I first heard like the idea that like an emotion is a combination of a thought and a sensation.
Yeah.
Like one way that I said it was, it's a sensation with a story attached to it.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah. I was in a somatic.
Oh, sorry. I had a question for you, but I don't want to cut you off if you were about to go in a different direction.
Can you remember?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I was at a somatic experiencing training, and out of the blue, this trainer was like, well, an emotion's a combination of a thought and a sensation. And I just kind of like came out of my chair. I was like, I wanted to be like, who said that? Like, because I want to credit them, but I want to shift gears into talking about some of the early theories of constructed emotion. But let me ask, like, what was the question?
Well, that's actually what I was going to ask you about. Was
okay.
It's easy to see how we get backwards, as it were, from the three building blocks to this, oh, wow, that must mean that emotion is not basic. So, what is emotion? But, what's interesting to me is that you've actually made the theory of constructed emotion kind of a central part of CA, and I'm wondering why that is. Why we don't just focus on the building blocks themselves. Like, why does it matter that emotion is constructed?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Like, where do my mind's jumping all over, but the first theory that I came across was when I was in my master's. The first thing I read about that aligned with this thing I was hearing in mindfulness, that an emotion is a combination of thought and sensation. And it was an experiment. It's called a Schachter-Singer experiment, or the two-factor theory. Well, it led to what's called the two-factor theory of emotion. So in this experiment, this was done in, I think it was 1962. These two researchers named Schachter and Singer, they did an experiment that would be illegal today, like a lot of those back then. A lot of people were harmed during that time period with research. No one was physically harmed, although that's probably debatable, honestly. But what they did would be illegal and unethical because they lied to the participants. Now we have informed consent. And so what they did was they told the participants that they were going to give them vitamin shots and monitor to see if they had any physical reactions to the vitamins. But they really gave them shots of adrenaline, which created really big sensations, really big physiological responses. Everybody was sweating and flushing and, increased heart rate, respiration. They were jacked up. And they put the participants in small groups, and within each small group they planted what they call a stooge, or a confederate, which is a research term for it's an actor. So the stooges were pretending to either be really happy or really angry. And then Schachter and Singer went to each participant and asked them, what emotion are you feeling? And all the ones with the happy stooges said they felt happy, and all the ones with the angry stooges said they felt angry.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So they realized, okay, everyone's experiencing the same sensations, but everyone's interpreting their emotional reactions depending on the context, what they believe is happening, the thoughts that they have. So they came up with a theory, the two-factor theory of emotion, which basically said that an emotion is a combination of a thought and a sensation. So I ran with that for a long time as a therapist. I began to explore and talk to clients about what if we stopped talking really about emotions. Let's say somebody say they feel anxious. So instead of focusing on the anxiety, what if we focused on the thoughts and the sensations that were making up that experience?
Yeah.
And I didn't even have the language to say that it constructed it. This was just sort of early on. And I remember I was talking to a friend of mine who's a doctor that I used to go around. We used to teach workshops on chronic pain together. And we talked a lot about this idea, and he was really intrigued by it. And one day we were hanging out. He's like, "Oh, I got a book for you to read." And it was Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, How Emotions Are Made. She's the person who developed the theory of constructed emotion, which is an evolution of some of the earlier studies like the Schachter-Singer experiment. And I got that book and started reading it, and I was like, holy shit. It's this is a scientific theory that backs up what I'm doing now. That ended up being huge for constructed awareness, especially when I moved away from EMDR and really launched CA as its own model. And there was no research for it.
Yeah.
That the theory of constructed emotion, Barrett's work, really provided a theoretical underpinning to really get it off the ground. Because without it, I would just be saying, hey, here's just an idea that I came up with, which really it was. But to be able to frame it under that was great. Later, though, because that's 2 building blocks. Okay, where did the third building block come from? It came from like working with clients. I did a podcast a few months ago on CA and EMDR, and talk about this. With EMDR, you ask as a therapist, "What are you noticing now?" And the client would answer, however. But I noticed that they would answer. People tended to answer one of 3 ways. I noticed like, okay, people are like, some people answer with all thoughts. Some people answer with all sensations. And I knew those 2 building blocks. But then also noticed that there was another group of people that they tended to answer more externally. They would talk about anybody but themselves, or they would like edit themselves to make sure I was comfortable, like almost like they were taking care of me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I started realizing, hey, there's this third part. And when I went back to Schachter and Singer, I realized it was in there. They missed it. The external was the stooge. It was the external thing that was influencing the thinking, which was influencing, and that's the thought.
God,
and
that's amazing. And then that's how you account for the cultural or this social aspect. Is, of course, it's coming from outside, and so you've got sensations and thoughts are making emotions, but they're actually being guided, shaped, even perhaps taught.
That's right.
By people around us. That would explain why we do see different emotional profiles in different cultures, a different type of, just different kinds of experiences, In Japan, I think it's called aware. There's this feeling, and what it means is the feeling you get when you're staring into something vast, like the sea, and you realize that there are things that you will never get to experience or that you will never get to see,
Yeah, and that's great. That's the thing. Notice you have to do like a whole paragraph to describe what they would describe with one word. Like we don't have a word for that, so we would have to describe it like you did. But for someone in Japan, it's like that's very real. That one word is understood by everybody, and it can be conceptualized right into that one phrase or one word.
Yep, and because it's like that, right? It's the reason that we struggle with the idea that emotions are not basic is because someone's angry and it's like, I'm just angry. Like they're not. It's happened so fast. I mean, this is the part of the power of the therapeutic question, where is it in your body, right? I mean, it peels apart.
What is the thought?
Yeah, what is the thought, right, absolutely, because it peels these things away from each other.
Or even what's happening externally. And that's a good point. I think like that was like missed for so long because it's not necessarily, an external trigger isn't always required.
Yeah.
Like how many times have you been a nervous wreck sitting in a room where you're completely safe and stable, like there's nothing wrong?
Yep.
That just shows that like at that point it's thoughts and sensations. But there's plenty of times where something externally will trigger. A couple days ago, it was last week, I was going with a hike with my daughter, and I stopped to check the mail and opened the door, put my foot down. I looked down, there was a snake about 8 inches from my foot. Right. Sorry, listeners, if that triggered you. It triggered me. But what did it trigger? Thoughts and sensations. Yeah. So I had a thought that was like, like that was the thought. And then I said several words to my daughter after that. But it's like what was coming to mind, and I had a really intense pressure, and my temperature changed in my body. So it's like as the external thing combines with the thought and the sensation, that creates the emotion that I would call fear in that moment. So that's a really simple example of how like fear was constructed by those different elements.
Yeah.
Those building blocks in that moment. But it's not always required. And like I explain it sometimes, it's like, our emotions, like animals in the wild, their emotions are more like physiological. Ours are more psychological.
If we use sort of old psychoanalytic language, you could talk about uncoded affect, right? So affect naming some kind of set of sensations in the body that are not yet conceptualized. And that might be a good way to describe what a deer or a lion experiences, right? That there's something in them that has a kind of compelling force, but it's us who look at them and say, oh, he's angry, he's nervous, he's sad, or whatever about a given animal. The animal's not, strictly speaking, any of those things. It's something almost unfathomable to us.
That's right. And I think animals can't pull emotions. They can't pull the parts together into a single concept. So technically, I think Barrett even argues this in the book, technically animals don't experience emotions, not in the way that we do, because they can't pull the different building blocks together into a word like fear. Right. They experience the different building blocks or the different aspects separately. Yeah. I don't know how, let's say a zebra sees a lion coming toward it. There's the external trigger, lion coming toward it. There's going to be some sort, I don't know how they think, I don't want to claim how they think, but there's some sort of mental recognition, certainly, of danger. And then there's sensation, and that creates, I guess what we could conceptualize as fear, but it's not pulled together that way. But it causes the zebra to run just fast and hard enough till it looks back and its buddy's being eaten instead of it, and so. And
it's fine.
At that point, there's a recognition of no more danger. The sensation stops, and it just eats grass. It doesn't do because it can't think of anything that's not happening now.
Right.
It can't think of the future or the past or fantasy. So it's not sitting around going what we would do. Yeah. It's not saying I'll never forgive myself. We should have a memorial service. None of that. Yep. But that's what we would do because we have a mind that can think that way. So it's we are able to conceptualize. We're able to think about things that are not happening right now. We usually think about stuff that's not happening right now.
Especially you and me as mentally oriented people.
Right.
But
and so I'll say real quick, and that's how we wind up sitting in a room where we're safe and stable in every way, and we're just a nervous wreck because the thoughts and the sensations are just fueling each other.
Yeah, and by contrast to, flip it around, it's also why, if you go back to the zebra example, the zebras don't get PTSD, right? Because, for example, a Buddhist perspective, concepts alienate us from sensations and by extension from mindful present awareness, right? So, the zebra is feeling all of it as it's happening precisely because it has no concept. Whereas we have minds where we can disappear, we can tell a story, we can vanish into thought. And the problem, of course, then is that something stays unprocessed in the body, which is why somatic work ends up being such a vital part, alongside, of course, the others, of trauma work. Right? That you have to be here now. But of course, one of the innovations of CA is that it doesn't abandon thought as part of the process. If traditionally talk therapy is over-reliant on thought and somatic therapies are over-reliant on soma, what we get with CA, and this is to me one of the most fascinating things about CA, is that these three building blocks aren't privileged relative to each other like they are in so many other traditions. They're all just there. And that gets back to what you're saying about awareness. Not trying to drive change, just trying to bring awareness to things, and then change happens on its own. The kind of radical nonviolence of that approach is really astonishing.
Yeah, because I think when somebody's I feel anxious, it's that just ends the curiosity. So what we do as CA therapists, okay, well, let's take that and let's deconstruct that into what's going on in your body. What are there words or pictures that are coming to mind? Is there anything in the environment that's triggering that? And it just takes it to a whole new level than doing something like a feeling wheel or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's all based more on that classical view.
Yeah. I mean, something that strikes me, it keeps coming to mind just because you keep talking about anxiety, is, the first person to really theorize anxiety was the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote on anxiety. He also wrote a book, Fear and Trembling. And I think something that's really interesting about that early philosophical approach to the problem of anxiety is the trembling bit, right? Is the fact that here's this philosopher, he's a theologian, he's highly mentally oriented, and even for him, anxiety is something that happens to an embodied being. And you want to talk about curiosity about anxiety. I mean, someone writes book after book after book on it. But again, we shut it down. This is the danger of emotion words, right? Is that you shut it down. And I mean, I think a lot about, were you the one that talked about the noise gate thing, the noise gate metaphor? You might want to explain that, because I actually think it's, because that metaphor helps us understand why we don't perceive the sensations, right? Because by the time, you explain it. And yeah.
Yeah, but before I do, I just keep thinking, like, we're talking about like the zebras. It's like the rest of the animal kingdom is not mentally oriented. It's all sensation and external. And it's interesting to think. This is the first time I've ever thought about this. It's like, how backwards is that?
Yeah.
For us to be, and our culture to be so mentally oriented, and all the people who have wrote and theorized about emotions have probably all been mentally oriented too. It's like almost the people who are least qualified experientially to talk about it.
That's
because we're naturally more cut off from our environment and our bodies. But I think especially it's almost like an epidemic in our culture.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely.
Being cut off from our bodies. But the noise gate, that's because my background is in audio. I was a music producer before I became a therapist, and there's a tool that producers and audio engineers use called a noise gate. And what that does is, so it used to be like a rack unit, but now it's software. But it's like a knob that adjusts a threshold up and down. So everything below the threshold gets muted. Everything above the threshold is allowed to come through. The audio is allowed to come through. So it's like if you were going to give a presentation and you wanted to record the audio of it, but there's like a lot of like AC or like electrical noise in the background, you could use a noise gate, because it's like if you're not talking, it's going to mute all of that background noise. But as soon as you speak and your voice goes above the threshold, it allows that. And as soon as you stop talking, it cuts that out again. So I use that as an example to say it's okay, we all have like a threshold for experience. And in this example, we'll talk about sensation. So it's like, imagine that my threshold as a mentally oriented person for sensation is set really high, like a 8 out of 10. I don't normally notice my body unless it's like really intense, like pleasure or pain. Other than that, it's like everything usually is just cut off. And I think that's how most people like go around their lives. It's like our sensation thresholds are set really high. We tend to just not feel our body, so we're missing this huge part of our existence. Like we're cut off from, like, there's so much information. There's so much information that the body provides, and if you're cut off from that, man, you're just missing out on a lot of like information that could tell you what you want, or like if someone's crossing a boundary, or like if you're crossing someone's boundary, or you name it. If you want to be with somebody or you don't, is this a good decision or not a good decision? The body's given so much information, and without it, I mean, it's just like, I feel like we're just trying to put together life with half the instructions. It's just like 1/3 of the instructions for folks like us.
And there's a political component to that too, because, for example, for a great deal of English history, right, every man was obligated to spend something like 2 hours training to be in the military. And if you look at our history here in America, we've got white supremacism and slavery, right? And it's, how do you control somebody? You take their body away from them. So what you were saying before about this epidemic of mental orientation in our culture, I mean, I think it comes from militarism, slavery, having a radically hierarchical culture that requires us to do so much work. I mean, even the contemporary computer using desk worker is going to develop all kinds of physical problems because in order to meet their productivity requirements, they have to cut themselves off. You know, and we've been doing it for a long time, and we're very good at it, doing it to each other, doing it to ourselves. And that's not true of cultures that don't have that kind of history. It's just not.
Right. And also, like, I think it's not just like a problem with being mentally oriented, it's a problem with being externally oriented too. Yeah. So it's like not experiencing the sensations. Because it's just as celebrated, I think, in our culture to put the needs of others before your own. Right. I mean, that goes way back.
Absolutely. That's a very old commitment. One of the big challenges that Christianity posed to Stoicism, which it adopted a great deal of, was, you know, hey, you got a lot of other people you should be worried about, you know. And maybe it goes way too far, right? Because we can't feel other people's feelings for them. We can't make other people feel certain ways. This is another basic CA, or, you know, I'm trying to find a word you haven't already used as part of the logic of the system. But basically in CA, you kind of have to just accept you can't make anybody feel anything. And even if you could, you don't have the right to determine for them what they should feel.
Yeah. That's the nonviolence.
That
we talk about. Yeah. Nonviolence in therapy, where we're not imposing our will at all, even if that will is that they should feel better, like, because that can interfere with the client's natural process to heal and grow. So instead, it's like we try not to interfere at all. Instead, just help them like understand themselves more through this framework of the building blocks and their orientation. And things just naturally start to happen. Change just starts to occur.
Something I want to bring in, speaking of, just because, you know, one of the central things that we've been talking about is emotion being a construct. Something that forms the heart of my understanding of that fact is that Shakespeare invented the word lonely. That we didn't have, we did not have a word for lonely in English or other European languages or Latin or Greek, right? The closest we had in English was the word desolate, which was used to describe, for example, a castle located far in the north with no other buildings near it would be like a desolate castle, but it wasn't an emotion at all. And so, you know, it's often said that when you go from, and here's my English degree coming out, but when you go from Chaucer and other, you know, Renaissance or early modern writers to Shakespeare, there's like a pop into a kind of psychological third dimension, right? And I think personally, if we want to explain exactly how that happened, we'd have to think a lot about the Protestant Reformation, because it's like 3 generations in a row of people witnessing mass murder. That kind of thing can change what it means to be human. And I think coming out of that, it's always the artists, and in this case, especially Shakespeare. And ever since Shakespeare, psychologists have been referring back to Shakespeare to explain, to illustrate, right? And so, you know, not only is emotion constructed, not only is it cultural and social, but it has a history that can be mapped through language precisely because it is conceptual, right? And so, you know, I think one thing that would be fascinating is the sensation part. Could someone do a history of sensations? Could someone do a cultural study of sensations? But emotions...
Like the words?
Well, no, not even. Like if it were somehow, this would be magical, but possible to see if bodies felt differently at different times, you know, just sensationally.
Yeah, but, I mean, I tend to think we've probably felt the same stuff
I think so
forever.
Too. Yeah, I agree with that.
It's just how we describe it has changed.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we're talking about this because this is like really, I think, important to like the way CA conceptualizes emotions, because an emotion is just as we've talked about as a concept, but they're just words.
Mm-hmm.
They're just words that, according to the CA theory, describe the collection of the building blocks.
Yeah.
And so our minds do that all the time. They'll take something that's made of a bunch of parts,
Yeah.
and they'll put one word to it. Like I always say, it's easier to say I want spaghetti for dinner than to say I want boiled noodles, ground beef, tomato sauce, onions, garlic. If I had to like say all the ingredients for it, it would be like a miserable existence if we had to go. So what our brains do is they take something that's made of a bunch of parts and they put one word to it, like spaghetti, and we all culturally agree that that combination of things is spaghetti.
Yeah.
And like my favorite example though is a storm. That within a storm, there's all these things you can experience with your senses, and you can even measure these things with instruments. Like you can see the lightning and hear the thunder and feel the wind and rain, but where is storm?
Oh, I love that question.
Where's the entity? Like the entity storm, the thing that is storm. Like if we were in a storm, I said, Phil, go put your finger on storm. Like you'd realize really quickly that, well, there is no storm.
That's great.
Storm's just a word we use to describe the collection of those things. And it's interesting that we could even have some of those things and not other things, and it's not a storm, right? And so, but there is no storm. And the same thing is true for, I think, like an emotion like anxiety. Like, okay, you're experiencing anxiety. You can notice the thing that's happening externally that's triggering it. You can notice like what you're seeing or hearing in your mind, the thoughts, the mental building block. You can notice what you're feeling in your body. But where is anxiety? There is no anxiety. And that's where people, I'm sure, I've come across as weird to people, because I'll go so far as to say that I don't think emotions are real. Barrett, in her book, she argues that they are real, and they are real. I agree with that, but they're only real conceptually. They're not real as an actual physical things.
Yeah.
But if you read some of like the earlier, you go back even earlier in your studies, but like the classical theory of emotion that started with Darwin.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
A lot of the theorists that have written over the years about emotions, they literally talk about emotions as entities. They'll use that word as entities that live inside of us. Like we have like a fear entity. But when you go looking for it, like the self, right? It's like there's nothing there. You can't put your finger on it. And so that's why I think this more modern way of looking at emotions that's really being pioneered and pushed forward by Barrett is so groundbreaking. And as far as I know, constructed awareness is the only therapy that uses this.
I want to just, there's what you've been saying is so rich. There's so much there. One thing is, I do think there have been, I'm thinking specifically of very early Buddhism, but there are these there are these successful attempts to dissolve emotion into parts. If you look at early Buddhist texts, for example, feeling tone, right? Does it feel positive, neutral, or negative? Now, it's different than CA, perhaps not as effective or useful, but there is this intuition, I think, that emerges every so often, that there's something we're getting wrong by simply accepting emotions at face value. But I think it's typically something that comes from, mystical or introspective traditions. So that's one thing. Another thing I've been thinking about with regard to animals again is just like, so I was recently helping to train some Weimaraners. You fire like a pigeon toy into a lake, and then the Weimaraner goes, and they have so much fun, and they get so excited, and then like for the first time in its entire life, one of them will bite somebody, and the dog doesn't know it just gets energized in some way, right? Or it's like everyone's had the experience of petting a cat and then suddenly the cat bites you in the hand, right? these animals are not. You can see that the energy is uncoded when you just watch even domesticated animals, and I think that's such a stark difference from the almost the rigid almost way that concepts guide sensations in one channel or another in us.
And the code would be the thought, right?
Yeah,
it sounds
exactly.
like a very mental thing.
Yeah, the code would be the thought, exactly. Which the animals are not.
Which puts it into categories, like you said, of like desirable, undesirable, neutral, which is still judgmental.
That's judgmental, I agree. As opposed to just
Right.
accepting it all, you know?
Yeah, instead of being like it's hot or it's warm or it's pulsing,
Yeah.
and that's sort of like the way that we work with it.
Right, absolutely.
Talking about dogs, it made me think of my cousin told me once that he watched this documentary about drug dogs, like police drug dogs.
Yeah, yeah.
And like he said that people think that like, okay, I'll take the cocaine that I'm trying to ship.
Yeah.
I don't know what the term is. Yeah. Smuggle.
Smuggle,
and so
I
they
guess,
think, they're like, let's wrap it in saran wrap, put it in the gas tank, fill up the gas tank with gasoline because there's no way the dog could smell it. But they still do. and they said that in the documentary that the people said that the way a dog smells, like when they smell beef stew, they don't smell beef stew. They smell broth, carrots, onions, potatoes, beef. Right? They smell it all individually.
Yeah.
So whenever the drug dog smells, when the cocaine, it smells cocaine, saran wrap, gasoline, metal. That's the tank. It smells it all separately. So I was like, that's a perfect example for what we're talking about here, because an animal can't take the parts and put it into
absolutely
one word. It can't say beef stew. It like experiences all of those things separately, which I think is a rawer, like more pure way of connecting with experience. And in a way, that's what we're doing with CA. We're taking that, like, okay, what is the beef stew of emotion?
Yeah, I love that.
Yes, anxiety, right? So we keep using that. It's a good one. So instead of like, so okay, I'm anxious. What tells you that? That's a question we ask a lot, and we begin to break it down into, and we get into the nitty gritty. It's like, okay, what are the specific sensations that you feel? Like, are you seeing or hearing thoughts? Like, what are the colors in the thought? What are the words? Where are the words coming from?
Yeah,
you name it. Like, we could spend sessions with. We spend sessions with clients, just really dissecting these experiences into its smaller parts. And it seems to me that when that happens, man, it takes the sting out of whatever that experience is, because you're bringing curiosity to it. And again, it's another one of those things I really wish I knew who said this so I could cite them, but leave it in a comment if you know, right? But somebody told me once that like fear and curiosity can't coexist.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I don't know where from, but yeah.
So, an animal's only curious when it's safe. So whenever, like I said before, if you're just like, I'm anxious, there's no curiosity there. But if you're like, okay, well, let's break that down. Like, what are the thoughts that are coming to mind? Like, what do you see in your mind? Like, what do you feel in your chest? And you really begin to bring curiosity. Like, is there anything in the environment that's triggering? That's an interesting one, because like a lot of times people are like, no, like I'm actually like super safe right now. And that changes the experience, right?
And this is one of the reasons that mindfulness can be helpful, right? Because if you are safe here and now and not in physical pain, you can get yourself out of your thoughts and into those other building blocks, right? I think what's really interesting, though, in what you're suggesting, and I think new, right, is that you are not necessarily saying to somebody, at least not every time, here is a road out of what you're feeling. Just we can ignore this part, or we can focus on that part, and we can get you grounded. It's let's actually get curious about all of it, right? Without worrying about whether we're going to stop feeling it. And just what is it, right? What is it made out of? What thoughts, what sensations, what perceptions? And to my mind, I think that is a much more intrepid project than just saying, I'm going to help you feel better right now.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as far as like, wanted to mention too, like the theory of constructed emotion, like guides this, but it's from all the reading that I've read her book, she's published and contributed to countless papers. I've read a lot of those for a literature review for a paper that I published on the theory of constructed emotion in CA that you could look up. But from everything I've read, the theory of constructed emotion doesn't give any sort of information or opinion about what the building blocks are that construct experience. It just says that emotions are constructed by these smaller elements, so what are those elements? And I think that's where CA takes things a little further and makes it where it's applicable to therapy or like a personal practice.
Yeah.
Right. So we're actually identifying what those building blocks are.
Yeah. No,
that construct it.
I agree. I mean, and I think there's nothing out there that I know of that does this, that breaks experience down and then uses that as the basic, almost physics or something of experience. And it really is. And there's so many things that come out of that too. I mean, no other form of therapy goes unchanged once you think about the insights of CA, right? So just as an example, I mean, even if you're just talking about grounding techniques, well, there are actually 3 dimensions on which those need to be imagined, right? There would be external resources, there would be internal resources, and there would be cognitive resources, right? I mean, so for just off the top of my head, or I mean, another thing I keep coming back to, because there's an affinity with existential psychology in a way, in the sense that you're not trying to turn away from discomfort, you're trying to understand it. But you take something like anxiety, for example, which has always been at the heart of both psychoanalysis and existential psychology. Whenever those 2 disciplines have tried to understand anxiety, they've tried to understand it conceptually alone, right?
Yeah.
And then when you look at what the neuroscientists are doing with it, that's even more conceptual, really, because they're just describing it from this third-person perspective of, I could go on and on about what the failures of that are therapeutically. But what we're doing in CA is actually trying to understand it like almost ontologically, like what actually is the thing. Experientially. I mean, and you can do that in a kind of blind, fumbling way if you don't have an organizational system that helps you know what you're looking at.
It creates a framework for understanding the emotions. Yeah, that's the way I always think about it.
And I think that's been one of the, ever going all the way back to phenomenology, one of the big blind spots, one of the stumbling blocks of the exploration of emotion has been because there isn't a theory of atomic particles, as it were, right? A perception, a sensation, thought. Because that's been lacking, it's always been such a disorganized effort, right? There's just which emotions are primary. That's a good classic example of the way people go wrong, right?
That goes back to Darwin.
Yeah, exactly. Or still,
I assume wasn't a very emotional person.
No, not at all, in my opinion. I mean, compared to others, just a very sort of centered guy by all accounts, and very cognitive, but actually externally oriented. If you want to get into that, that's a whole other thing. Had to be, right? But just this idea, or Sylvan Tompkins, right, who wrote Shame and Its Sisters is an anthology of his work. But he was seeking the primary emotion. He treated shame as a thing that couldn't be further subdivided into anything, and then tried to derive every emotion out of shame. I mean, this project of what is an emotion has constantly reemerged, usually multiple times per year. And I feel that CA is that it has a way of dealing with this question that is unprecedented. And I think that's an amazing. See, here I'm being incredibly mentally oriented, right? I'm talking about the concept of the concept of the concept here.
Yeah, that's where a lot of like the emotion talk just feels like wordplay to me. It's like you're just subdividing it into words, not experiences, and that's where I think that's what CA is trying to do. It's like, let's understand it subjectively, right? But I think like the theory of constructed emotion creates that great outlook, I guess, and then CA comes along and provides the framework for it that I think is really beneficial, as far as like how to practice it. Here's a question you may know the answer to. How old is the word emotion?
Oh, that's a great question.
Because that's a concept.
Yeah.
That someone had to make a word for.
Oh, man. That's a great question.
I learned it at some point. I think it was around like the 1700s.
That would make sense.
Yeah. And almost all of our emotion words that we use are really no more than like, 200 years old?
Yeah. I mean, and this is also a translation problem, like if you look at Achilles in the Iliad when Patroclus dies, if you look at the behaviors that are described, he tears his clothes, he rolls around in the dirt, he weeps, he kills, I think it's Hector, but whoever it was that killed Patroclus, and then like drags the corpse around like all over the place from the back of it. To just call that grief or anger or and I think it's a cop out to do the only thing we can do from this far in the future, which is to just think of it as mixed emotions. I mean, frankly, yeah. I think that the Greeks had experiences we just know nothing of, right? And I think that they had their own words for that, which we have sort of mistranslated into our own language of emotion. And by the way, I'm not the only person to talk about all these things. There's a lot. You could fill a few shelves with books on the history of emotion from a literary perspective. So I'm not really saying anything, as shocking as it can sound, it's not controversial.
Well, it's making me think too, even like how things have changed in, like the last, 100 years. Like, as someone who lives now, like I can't understand what groovy was like to someone in the 60s, right?
That's
like
a great example.
And like I look at like my kids and their generation, it's like Gen Z. I mean, they're creating their own emotional words.
I know.
Right, and it's happening fast too. So I'm excited to see how that plays out in this light. As far as like the development, the construction of emotion. But like, I hate to feel, it makes me feel old, but I'll hear kids, teenagers talk, and it's like I don't get it. And I'm sure my parents felt the same way, but it's like, but yeah, and it's there's whole cultures that don't have words for like anger or sadness.
That's right.
That's one thing that Barrett talks about in her book. Like she said, there's a tribe, like Tahitian tribe, that has no concept for sadness.
Amazing.
They don't have a word for it. Like they call it pea pea, and it basically, if they feel sad, like what we would call sad, they describe it as like they're sick.
Yeah. Now that you mention, I think I've heard about that from you. That's an amazing way to think about that.
Yeah, but they're having probably the same experiential, like building block experiences, but they're conceptualizing it differently. Not even as an emotion; it's a sickness, which is kind of wild to think about. But like, so if we're theorizing, we're guessing that emotion, the word emotion, was invented in the 1700s. Like, wonder what were they using before that?
Well, feeling, sentiment, these words that well, feeling, for example, ties us back into sensation in a really interesting way, in a way that emotion is a sort of escape from as a word. But sentimentality, that is a really interesting question, because in the 18th century, it's really more about morality than anything else, right? That sentiment is, the idea of a sentimental education, or the theory of moral sentiment, that it was this attempt to make morality something basic, an attempt to make morality something that was empirical, that you could actually, find in the body, as it were.
It's so mental.
So mental. It's in fact, this is worth saying. In fact, in the theory of moral sentiment, the very beginning, Adam Smith writes, "I see my brother on the rack," and he describes a scene of seeing a man tortured, and he says, like, I don't have any feeling in my body, right? I can't experience what he's experiencing. I actually have to decide to remember some vaguely similar experience and then extrapolate in my own head to get some sense of, like, his pain. It's insane. I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to use that word these days.
That sounds like, it's like a mentally oriented person's attempt at empathy.
Exactly. I mean, an extremely mentally oriented person's attempt at empathy. But the fact of the matter was, this was not something that made people stop at the time. It just, this was the way, I mean, it's so ironic, right? Because empiricism is all about, reality and perception and sensation. But it's still philosophy, not therapy, right? So it completely misses the mark. But I also think that in a way, it's probably true that the level of mirror neuron activity that we have today is greater than it was then. That it was probably harder to find empathy in the body back then, and not least of all, of course, because they were looking for morality. But my point is that we started out early on in the conversation. We were talking about, to what extent has sensation changed over time. I agree with you that in general, I don't think it's changed much, but its intensity, maybe that has. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I like how we're sensitized to experience different things. But I tend to think, this is something I'd love to see as time plays out, if I'm right or not. Maybe we'll get an answer. But I think that, like, across cultures, everyone's experiencing the same building blocks. Through culture, through time.
Yep.
We have, the only thing that's changed is how we describe it.
I agree.
And the words that we use. And so, like, I guess the lesson of all this today is, like, there's more to an emotion than meets the eye or the words.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's more to it. And, like, that's what we're trying to do with CA. We're trying to have it, to take something like an emotion and understand it in the deepest way that we can. And through that, change starts to happen.
Yeah.
So we're at an hour.
All right.
Yeah.
Go out and try it, people. You'll see what we're talking about.
Yeah. We just hit the high spots with this too.
Yep.
It felt like, and we could just, maybe we'll do a part 2 one day. I would love that.
Cool.
But if somebody is, like, really listening to this, they're really connecting with you, and they're like, I'd like to look Phil up, and how would they get a hold of you?
A good way to reach me is just Google Phil Stillman 3 Oaks, and that'll take you right to my bio. And from there, you can get to my contact info. I'm pretty good about responding to folks who reach out. That's probably the best way to find me. I don't have, like, a Twitter or website of my own or anything yet.
Okay, that's smart. Great. If you are listening, you want to reach out to me, my personal website's tylerorr.com. But if you're interested in constructed awareness, you can go to constructedawareness.com. So there's all kinds of stuff. Just lots of resources on there to learn more about it, including the paper that I mentioned earlier that was published in the Journal of Humanistic Counseling. There's a link at the CA website which says publications. You can click on that and find that paper there. But this It's been awesome. I think we covered all the important stuff. Maybe if we do a part two, it'll be really getting into it on a deeper level.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much.
you.
Yeah, this has been great. And thank you for listening. And we'll catch you next time.